The phone rang at 3 in the morning, cutting through the silence of Dr. James Rivera's small apartment. He had been working late in his lab, analyzing genetic samples from his latest field research. The voice on the other end belonged to his research partner, Dr. Lisa Wong, and she sounded breathless with excitement. "James, you need to get here immediately," she said. "The villagers found something incredible, something we thought was gone forever." James rubbed his tired eyes and sat up straighter. Lisa wasn't the type to call unless it was truly important. They had been working together for over 8 years, studying endangered species in some of the most remote locations on Earth. Their current project focused on primates that were disappearing faster than they could document them. "What did they find?" James asked, already reaching for his travel bag. "A golden-crowned lungar, a female." "James, she's alive." The words hit him like a lightning bolt. Golden-crowned lungars were supposed to be extinct. The last confirmed sighting was over 10 years ago in the mountains of Myanmar. James and Lisa had spent countless hours searching for any trace of these beautiful primates. But every lead had ended in disappointment. Within hours, James was on a plane heading to the remote conservation station where Lisa worked. The flight seemed endless. He kept thinking about what this discovery could mean. If there was really a surviving golden-crowned langur, it would be the find of a lifetime. But it would also mean incredible responsibility. When James finally arrived at the station, Lisa met him at the entrance. Her eyes were bright with excitement, but he could also see worry lines around them. "She's in the back enclosure," Lisa said, leading him through the facility. "The villagers brought her here 3 days ago. They found her near their village acting strangely." "Strangely how?" James asked. "She wasn't afraid of humans. In fact, she seemed to be seeking them out. The villagers said she followed them around, making soft calls. They've never seen behavior like this before. They walked through the conservation station, past other rescued animals recovering in temporary homes. The facility was simple but well-equipped, designed to help injured wildlife before releasing them back to their natural habitats." Then James saw her. The langur sat quietly in a large naturalistic enclosure filled with trees and climbing structures. She was smaller than James had expected, with a distinctive golden crown of fur that gave her species its name. Her dark eyes were incredibly intelligent, and when she saw James, something remarkable happened. She approached the fence and made a soft, musical sound. It wasn't aggressive or fearful. It sounded almost like a greeting. "My goodness," James whispered. "She's beautiful." Lisa nodded. "We've been calling her Luna. She seems to understand that we're here to help. Watch this." Lisa made a gentle clicking sound, and Luna immediately responded with her own series of calls. It was like watching a conversation between 2 different species. "She's been doing this since she arrived," Lisa explained. "It's as if she knows. We're scientists." The local veterinarian examined her and confirmed she's healthy, probably about 7 years old. That means she's in her prime reproductive years. The weight of that statement settled over James like a heavy blanket. If Luna was truly the last of her kind, then time was running out. Female lungars typically had only a few good breeding years, and every month that passed reduced the chances of saving the species. Over the next few days, James observed Luna carefully. Her behavior was unlike anything he had seen in wild primates. She seemed to have developed an understanding that humans might be her only hope. When James worked at his laptop near her enclosure, she would sit close to the fence, watching quietly. When he made phone calls to other researchers, she appeared to listen, her head tilted as if she understood the importance of his conversations. The local villagers visited regularly, bringing fresh fruits and sharing stories about Luna. They had named her differently in their language, a word that meant the last flower. They spoke about her with deep respect and sadness, understanding what her presence meant. One elderly villager, who had lived in the mountains his entire life, told James something that made his heart heavy. "My grandfather used to tell stories about these golden monkeys. He said they were the guardians of the forest. Now she is alone, and the forest feels empty." James spent sleepless nights thinking about Luna's situation. During the day, he made countless phone calls to conservation organizations, zoos, and research facilities around the world. He sent photos and genetic samples to laboratories, hoping against hope that somewhere, somehow, there might be another golden-crowned langur. But as the days passed, Luna's behavior became more concerning. She seemed to sense the urgency of her situation. She would position herself near the communication equipment when James made his calls, as if she understood that these conversations were about finding others like her, sometimes late at night. James could hear her making long, mournful calls into the darkness. The sound broke his heart every time. It was the sound of a creature calling for family that would never answer. The responsibility weighed heavily on James's shoulders. He had dedicated his career to studying endangered species, but he had never faced a situation quite like this. Luna wasn't just another animal to be studied and protected. She represented the entire genetic legacy of her species. Every decision he made could determine whether golden-crowned langurs would exist in the future or become just another entry in the long list of animals lost forever. As he watched Luna one evening, sitting peacefully in her enclosure and grooming her distinctive golden fur, James made a promise to himself and to her. He would do whatever it took to find a way to save her species. The clock was ticking, but he wouldn't give up hope. Luna looked at him through the fence, her intelligent eyes seeming to understand his determination. In that moment, James felt the full weight of what it meant to be possibly the only person who could help the last of her kind. The search began at dawn the next morning. James sat at his laptop, surrounded by stacks of research papers and old photographs. He had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. Luna sat quietly in her enclosure nearby, watching him work as if she understood the importance of what he was doing. James started by reaching out to every wildlife organization he had ever worked with. He sent emails to researchers in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Each message contained the same desperate plea. Had anyone seen a golden-crowned langur? Did anyone have any information about surviving populations? The first responses were discouraging. Dr. Chen from Bangkok wrote back saying he hadn't seen one in 15 years. A researcher from Ho Chi Minh City said the same thing. One by one, the replies painted the same picture. The golden-crowned langur had vanished from the wild, but James refused to give up. He expanded his search, contacting museums and universities around the world.
Maybe.
Someone had preserved genetic material from old specimens. Maybe there were tissue samples sitting in freezers that could provide clues about where other populations might have existed. Lisa helped him organize the massive search effort. They created a database of every possible lead, no matter how small. They contacted indigenous communities throughout Southeast Asia, knowing that local people often had knowledge that scientists missed. What about private collectors? Lisa suggested. One afternoon. Sometimes people keep exotic animals illegally. James nodded grimly. He didn't like the idea of dealing with the illegal pet trade, but if it meant finding a male langur, he would explore every option. As the days passed, Luna's behavior became more intense. She seemed to sense the urgency of their search. Every morning, she would position herself where she could see James working. When he made phone calls, she would sit perfectly still, as if listening to every word. The most heartbreaking moment came when James played recordings of langur calls from his research archives. Luna's reaction was immediate and powerful. She pressed herself against the fence, calling back to the recordings with sounds that seemed filled with hope and longing. When the recordings ended, and no real langur answered, she became quiet and withdrawn for hours. She knows, Lisa said quietly. She understands that she's alone. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. James had posted Luna's story on social media, hoping it might reach someone with information. A young backpacker named David sent him a message from northern Laos. "I saw your post about the golden monkey," David wrote. "I'm not sure if this helps, but I'm staying near a Buddhist monastery in the mountains. The monks here take care of animals, and they have an old monkey that looks similar to your photos. They call him Grandfather." James's heart raced as he read the message. He immediately called David, who was more than happy to help. The young traveler described an elderly langur living peacefully at the monastery, cared for by monks who had rescued him years ago. "He's old," David explained. The monks said they found him injured about 10 years ago. They nursed him back to health, but he never left. They think he's around 15 years old now. 15 years old. That was ancient for a Lungar, but it also meant this could be one of the last males of the species. James felt a mixture of hope and worry. Even if this was a golden-crowned Lungor, would he be healthy enough to help save the species? James immediately began planning a trip to Laos, but first he needed to confirm that the monastery's Lungar was indeed the same species as Luna. He asked David to take detailed photographs and videos, which the young man was happy to do. When the images arrived, James and Lisa studied them carefully. The Lungar in the photos had the same distinctive golden crown, the same body structure, and the same intelligent eyes. There was no doubt this was a golden-crowned Lungar. "We found him," James whispered, hardly believing it was true, but finding. The male was only the beginning of a much more complicated challenge. The monastery was over 800 miles away, deep in the mountains of Laos. Getting there would require multiple flights, a long drive on rough roads, then a hike to reach the remote location. More importantly, James had to convince the monks to let him take their beloved companion. The Lungar had been living peacefully. At the monastery for a decade, the monks had cared for him, fed him, and given him a safe home. Would they understand the importance of bringing him to Luna? James also had to consider the risks. Moving a 15-year-old Lungar such a long distance could be dangerous. The stress of travel might be too much for the elderly animal. But without taking that risk, Luna would remain alone, and the species would die with her. Meanwhile, Luna's condition was becoming more concerning. She had stopped eating as much, and she spent long periods sitting motionless, staring into the distance. The veterinarian was worried about her mental health. Animals can suffer from depression, the vet explained. Luna understands her situation better than we might think. She's grieving for her lost family, her lost species. James made the difficult decision to travel to Laos immediately. Every day that passed made Luna's depression worse, and every day made the elderly male more fragile. Time was running out for both of them. As he prepared for the journey, James sat near Luna's enclosure one last time. She approached the fence and looked at him with those intelligent, hopeful eyes. "I'm going to find him," James promised her. "I'm going to bring him home to you." Luna made a soft sound, almost like she understood. For the first time in days, she seemed to have a spark of hope in her eyes. The next morning, James boarded a plane to Laos, carrying with him the hopes of an entire species. The search had led him to one possible answer, but the real challenge was just beginning. Would he be able to convince the monks to help? Would the elderly male survive the journey? And most importantly, would Luna and her potential companion be able to save their species from extinction? As the plane lifted off, James looked down at the mountains below and said a silent prayer. Somewhere in those mountains, the future of the golden-crowned Lungor was waiting. The journey to the monastery took 3 days. James flew to Vientiane, then took a small plane to a remote airstrip, followed by a bone-jarring 6-hour drive through mountain roads that seemed to disappear into the jungle. His guide, a local man named Bonmi, spoke little English, but understood the urgency of the mission. "Monastery, very peaceful place," Bonmi said as they climbed higher into the mist-covered mountains. "Monks take care of all animals. They have big hearts." When they finally reached the monastery, James was struck by its simple beauty. Ancient wooden buildings sat nestled among towering trees, and the sound of chanting drifted through the morning air. Monks in orange robes moved quietly through the grounds, tending to gardens and feeding various rescued animals. The head monk, Venerable Pra Samsak, greeted James with a warm smile. He spoke excellent English, having studied at universities in Bangkok years before becoming a monk. "We heard you were coming, Pra," Samsak said. "David, the young traveler, told us about your mission. We are honored to help, but we must think carefully about what is best for our old friend." They walked together to a large enclosure behind the main temple. There, sitting peacefully under a fig tree, was the most beautiful Lungor James had ever seen. Despite his age, Grandfather still had the distinctive golden crown that marked his species. His movements were slow and careful, but his eyes were bright and alert. We found him many years ago, Pra Samsak explained. He was badly injured, probably from a fight with other monkeys. We nursed him back to health, and he chose to stay with us. He has been our companion ever since. James watched grandfather carefully. The old lunger seemed content and healthy, despite his advanced age. But James could see the signs of aging, slower movements, graying fur around his face, and a tendency to rest more often. He is like family to us, another monk added. The children from the village come to visit him. He brings joy to many people. This was the dilemma James had feared. How could he ask these kind monks to give up their beloved companion? But how could he return to Luna empty-handed? "I understand your attachment," James said carefully. "But there is something you need to know. Grandfather might be the last male of his entire species. There is a female, alone and desperate, waiting for him. Without his help, these beautiful animals will disappear forever." Pra Samsak's expression grew serious. "Show us," he said simply. James pulled out his tablet and showed them videos of Luna. He explained her story, her depression, and her desperate calls into the empty forest. The monks watched in silence, their faces filled with compassion. "She is suffering," Pra Samsak observed. "Her suffering is different from physical pain. It is the suffering of loneliness, of being the last." The monks discussed among themselves in their local language. James waited anxiously, knowing that this decision would determine the fate of an entire species. But there was another problem. Even if the monks agreed to let grandfather travel, would the old Lungor survive the journey? James had consulted with veterinarians before making the trip, and they all expressed the same concern. Moving a primate across hundreds of miles could be fatal. "What if we bring the female here instead?" suggested one of the younger monks. "Our mountain is peaceful. Both Lungers could live here safely." James had considered this option, but Luna was already stressed and depressed. Moving her to a completely new environment might make her condition worse. Besides, the conservation station had better medical facilities if anything went wrong. Dr. Ketsana, a veterinarian from the nearest city, arrived the next day to examine grandfather. She was a small, determined woman who had worked with wildlife for over 20 years. "His heart is strong," she announced, after a thorough examination. "His breathing is good. He is old, yes, but he is healthy for his age. The journey will be risky, but it is possible." The ethical questions kept James awake at night. Was it right to force these animals together? They had lived their entire lives without each other. What if they didn't get along? What if the stress of meeting killed one of them? Called Lisa back at the conservation station. Luna's condition had worsened. She was barely eating and spent most of her time sitting motionlessly in the corner of her enclosure. "She's giving up," Lisa said, her voice heavy with sadness. "I think she's decided that there's no hope left." That news made James's decision easier. Luna was dying of loneliness. Even if bringing grandfather to her was risky, doing nothing was certainly fatal. Pra Samsak made the final decision after 3 days of meditation and discussion with his fellow monks. "Grandfather has lived a good life here," he said. "But if he can help save his species, that would be the greatest gift he could give to the world. We will let him go, but only if he chooses to go." Now, this was the most unusual part of the whole situation. The monks wanted grandfather to have a choice in his own fate. They brought him to the travel carrier and left the door open. If he entered willingly, they would know he was ready for the journey. James held his breath as grandfather approached the carrier. The old lunger sniffed it carefully, looked at the monks, then looked at James. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then, to everyone's amazement, grandfather walked into the carrier and sat down calmly. "He knows," whispered Pra Samsak. "Somehow, he understands." The preparations for the journey took another full day. Dr. Ketsana prepared special medications to keep grandfather calm during travel. The monks blessed him in a traditional ceremony. Local villagers came to say goodbye to the Lungor, who had been part of their community for so many years, as they prepared to leave. James felt the enormous weight of responsibility. He was carrying the genetic future of an entire species in a small travel carrier. If anything went wrong during the journey, the golden-crowned Lungers would be lost forever. Grandfather seemed remarkably calm during the trip. He ate the fruits the monks had packed for him, and even slept peacefully during the flights. It was as if he truly understood the importance of his mission. When they finally arrived back at the conservation station, Lisa was waiting with tears in her eyes. "How is Luna?" James asked immediately. "She's been different since yesterday," Lisa said. It's almost like she sensed something was happening. She's been more alert, more hopeful. As they carried Grandfather's carrier toward the station, James couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would these two lonely lungers recognize each other as the same species? Would they accept each other? Or would this incredible journey end in disappointment? The future of the golden-crowned lunger was about to be decided in the next few hours. The moment James had been dreaming about for months was finally here. He stood outside Luna's enclosure, holding Grandfather's carrier, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. Lisa stood beside him, equally nervous. They had prepared for this moment in every way possible. But nothing could guarantee how two lonely lungers would react to seeing each other after years of isolation. Luna sat in her usual spot near the fence, but something was different about her. She was more alert than she had been in weeks, her head tilted as if she was listening for something. When she saw the carrier, she immediately stood up and moved closer. "She knows," Lisa whispered. "Look at her body language. She's excited." James carefully placed the carrier near Luna's enclosure and slowly opened the door. Grandfather emerged cautiously, his old eyes blinking in the afternoon sunlight. He looked around the unfamiliar environment, then his gaze fell on Luna. What happened next took everyone's breath away. Lungers froze for a moment, staring at each other across the fence. Then Luna made a sound none of them had ever heard before, a soft musical call that seemed to carry years of loneliness and hope. Grandfather responded immediately with his own call. It was deeper, older, but filled with the same emotion. They approached the fence that separated them, and for the first time in possibly decades, two golden-crowned lungers looked into each other's eyes. "This is incredible," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. They recognized each other. The reunion was everything James had hoped for and more. Luna's depression seemed to lift instantly. She moved with energy she hadn't shown in months, calling to Grandfather and displaying behaviors that Dr. Ketsana identified as species-specific social interactions. But as the days passed, new challenges emerged. Grandfather, despite his amazing journey and seemingly good health, was showing signs of serious decline. The stress of travel, combined with his advanced age, was taking its toll. He was eating less and sleeping more. His movements became slower and more labored. "His heart is working harder than it should," Dr. Ketsana explained after examining him again. "The journey was successful, but it has weakened him significantly. I'm not sure how much time he has left." This news hit James like a physical blow. They had achieved the impossible by finding and reuniting the last two members of the species. But time was running out faster than anyone had expected. The situation became even more complicated when conservationists and ethicists from around the world began weighing in on the story. News of the reunion had spread through social media and scientific communities, creating both support and criticism. Dr. Patricia Woods, a prominent animal rights advocate, published an article questioning James's methods. "While the intention to save a species is admirable," she wrote, "we must ask whether forcing these animals into an artificial breeding situation is truly ethical. These lungers have lived their entire lives in captivity or semi-captivity. Perhaps allowing them to live out their days in peace, rather than pressuring them to reproduce, would be more humane." The controversy created additional stress for James and his team. Protesters gathered outside the conservation station, some supporting their work and others demanding the lungers be left alone. Media crews arrived daily, wanting to film the historic pair. But the most devastating blow came when Luna fell ill. 3 weeks after Grandfather's arrival, she began showing signs of severe stress. She stopped eating, became lethargic, and developed a respiratory infection that worried the entire veterinary team. The attention, the pressure, the constant presence of media, it's all too much for her, Dr. Ketsana explained. "Lungers are naturally shy creatures. All this activity is making her sick. James made the difficult decision to limit access to the Lungers completely. No more media visits, no more protesters, no more researchers except for essential medical care. He also had to consider whether separating Luna and Grandfather might reduce her stress levels. But when they tried to move Grandfather to a different enclosure, both Lungers became extremely agitated. Luna's condition worsened immediately, and Grandfather refused to eat entirely. It became clear that despite the complications, they needed to stay together. During Luna's illness, something beautiful happened. Grandfather, despite his own declining health, began caring for her. He would sit close to the fence near her resting spot, making soft comfort sounds. When she finally started eating again, he would eat at the same time, as if encouraging her. "Bonded," Lisa observed. "Look at how he positions himself to be near her. He's protecting her, even though he's the one who's more fragile." As Luna recovered from her illness, the team faced a new reality. Natural reproduction between the two Lungers was looking increasingly unlikely. Grandfather's age and declining health made it physically impossible, and Luna's stress-related illness had affected her reproductive cycle. James consulted with reproductive specialists around the world. The consensus was clear. If they wanted to save the species, they would need to use advanced reproductive technology. This meant collecting genetic material from both Lungers and potentially using surrogate mothers from closely related species. The ethical debates intensified. Some argued that using such technology was playing God with nature. Others insisted that extraordinary situations required extraordinary measures. "We're not just making a decision about two individual animals," James explained to a panel of international conservationists. "We're making a decision about whether an entire species continues to exist." The golden crown Lunger represents millions of years of evolution. Do we have the right to let that disappear when we have the technology to preserve it? Meanwhile, Luna and Grandfather continued their quiet existence at the conservation station. They had developed their own daily routines, their own ways of communicating. In the mornings, they would sit near each other and groom themselves. In the afternoons, Grandfather would rest while Luna explored her enclosure, always staying where he could see her. Visitors who saw them together often commented on how peaceful they seemed. Despite all the medical complications and ethical debates surrounding them, the two Lungers appeared content with each other's company, but James knew that contentment wasn't enough. Every day that passed was a day closer to losing both of them. Grandfather's health continued to decline, and Luna, while recovered from her illness, was also aging. At 8 years old, she was past her prime reproductive years. The pressure to make a decision about reproductive technology was mounting. Scientific institutions were offering funding and resources. The genetic material needed to be collected soon, before it was too late. As James watched the two Lungers sitting peacefully together one evening, he realized that the weight of an entire species' future rested on the decisions he would make. In the coming days, the reunion had been successful, but it had also revealed just how complex and difficult the path to species survival could be. The decision came on a quiet Tuesday morning in September. James had been awake all night, watching Grandfather struggle with his breathing. The old Lunger's condition had worsened dramatically over the past week, and Dr. Ketsana warned that they might only have days left. "We can't wait any longer," James told Lisa as they stood outside the Lunger enclosure. "If we're going to preserve their genetic material, it has to be now." The procedure was scheduled for the following day. A team of reproductive specialists flew in from Bangkok, bringing equipment that looked more suited to a human hospital than a wildlife conservation station. The plan was to collect genetic material from both Lungers under careful sedation, then begin the complex process of preservation and potential future reproduction. But that evening, something unexpected happened. As James sat in his office reviewing the medical procedures one final time, he heard Luna making sounds he had never heard before. They were soft, rhythmic calls that seemed almost like singing. He rushed to the enclosure and found both Lungers sitting close to the fence that separated them. Grandfather, despite his weakened state, was responding to Luna's calls with his own gentle sounds. They seemed to be having a conversation in their ancient language, sharing something that humans could never fully understand. "They know, Lisa," said, joining James at the observation window. "Somehow they know what's happening tomorrow." That night, James made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of keeping the Lungors separated before the procedure, he opened the gate between their enclosures. For the first time since their reunion, Luna and Grandfather could actually touch each other. The moment was magical. Luna approached Grandfather carefully, then gently groomed the golden fur on his head. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes peacefully. They spent the entire night together, two ancient souls, finding comfort in each other's presence. The medical procedure the next morning went better than anyone expected. Both Lungors handled the sedation well, and the specialists successfully collected the genetic material they needed. More importantly, they discovered that despite his age, Grandfather's genetic material was still viable. "This is remarkable, Dr. Chen," the lead reproductive specialist announced. "We have enough genetic diversity here to potentially restore the entire species. With modern technology and careful breeding programs, the golden-crowned Lungor could return from extinction." But the real breakthrough came when they analyzed Luna's genetic profile. The tests revealed something extraordinary. She carried genetic markers that were slightly different from Grandfather's, suggesting that there might have been multiple populations of golden-crowned Lungors in the past. This genetic diversity would be crucial for creating a sustainable population. Over the following months, the team worked with institutions around the world to develop a comprehensive conservation plan. The genetic material was divided and stored in multiple facilities across different countries, ensuring that even if one location failed, the species' genetic legacy would survive. Meanwhile, Luna and Grandfather settled into a peaceful routine. Together, Grandfather's health stabilized somewhat, though he remained frail. Luna seemed more content than she had ever been, no longer making those lonely calls into the empty forest. The media attention gradually died down, and the protesters moved on to other causes. This gave the Lungors the quiet environment they needed to simply be together. James often found them sitting side by side, grooming each other or sharing fruit, like an old married couple who had found each other after a lifetime of searching. First successful birth using their genetic material came 2 years later. A surrogate mother from a closely related Lungor species gave birth to a healthy female infant at a facility in Singapore. The baby, carrying Luna and Grandfather's genes, represented the first new golden-crowned Lungor, born in over 15 years. James received the news via video call, watching the tiny infant cling to her adoptive mother. Tears streamed down his face as he realized what this meant. The species had been pulled back from the brink of extinction. "Luna, Grandfather, look," he said, holding his tablet near their enclosure. The two Lungors seemed curious about the sounds coming from the device, though they couldn't understand what they were seeing. Over the next 3 years, 12 more golden-crowned Lungors were born through the program. Each birth brought new hope and new challenges. The babies needed to learn Lungor behaviors, and scientists worked carefully to ensure they would eventually be able to survive in the wild. Grandfather passed away peacefully on a warm spring morning, surrounded by the care team that had become his family. He was nearly 18 years old, ancient for a Lungor. Luna mourned him deeply, sitting quietly for days and refusing her favorite foods. But gradually, she began to recover. The conservation station had become her permanent home, and she seemed to understand her role as the mother of her species. When videos of the young Lungors were shown to her, she would watch with apparent interest. Making soft sounds that the researchers interpreted as approval. James often reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had started as a desperate attempt to save two lonely animals had become a symbol of hope for conservation efforts worldwide. The Golden-Crowned Lungor program became a model for other species recovery projects. 5 years after Grandfather's arrival at the station, James stood watching Luna as she sat in her favorite spot under the large fig tree. She was older now, moving more slowly, but her eyes still held that remarkable intelligence that had first captured his heart. "You did it, old girl," he said softly. "Your species is going to survive." Luna looked at him with what seemed like understanding, then returned to grooming her distinctive golden crown. In laboratories around the world, her genetic legacy was being carefully preserved and multiplied. In breeding facilities across Southeast Asia, young lungers carrying her genes were learning to climb and call and live as their ancestors had for millions of years. The last of her kind had become the first of a new beginning. Through science, compassion, and the remarkable bond between two lonely animals. The golden-crowned Lungor had been given a second chance at existence. James knew that Luna's story would be told for generations, not just as a tale of scientific achievement, but as a reminder of what was possible when people refused to give up hope. She had asked him, in her own way, to help father the future of her species, and together they had succeeded. As the sun set over the conservation station, Luna made one of her soft, musical calls. This time, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded like contentment, like peace, like the satisfied sigh of someone who had completed the most important work of their life.